Hosffman Ospino is an associate professor of theology and religious education at Boston College School of Theology and Ministry, where he is also director of graduate programs in Hispanic ministry. Dr. Ospino is the principal investigator for the National Study of Catholic Parishes with Hispanic Ministry and co-investigator for the National Survey of Catholic Schools Serving Hispanic Families. He is currently advancing a national study on Latino Catholic vocations. He has authored and edited over 13 books and dozens of essays. Dr. Ospino serves on the boards of several national organizations as an officer of the board of directors of the Catholic Theological Society of America and the Academy of Hispanic Theologians of the United States. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ospino here tonight.
Good evening, everyone. It is a true pleasure to be here with you this evening as part of this lecture series sponsored by the Lumen Christi Institute. I want to express my sincerest gratitude to Dr. Thomas Levergood, director of the Institute, for the invitation to share these thoughts. Dr. Michael Le Chevalier, associate director of the Institute, for being a guardian angel preparing logistics. Andrea Leal, who recently joined the Institute staff, and all who have made this event possible. And thank you, all of you, for your interest in this particular topic, particularly as you join the reflection on what it means to be American and Catholic in the 21st century. My lecture tonight is titled American Catholic Contours and Detours in a 50% Hispanic Latino Church. I offer it to you as a series of reflections that call for a response and an embrace of who we are as Roman Catholics in the United States in this century. My presentation has 5 moments. The first moment, allow me to journey with you briefly on a sketch of the American Catholic experience as it is today and how it is currently understood regularly. Place matters. Where we stand, where we live, where we advance our scholarship and engage in reflection with one another matter. Chicago is a most fascinating city to engage in dialogue about the idea of American Catholicism. And we also do this in the premises of the University of Chicago, considered a jewel in the world of American higher education. Chicago, along with many other large cities in the Midwest and Northeast, for nearly 2 centuries, were the epicenters of American Catholic life. What happened in Chicago, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, St. Louis, and other similar cities, on matters of Catholicism, almost immediately reverberated throughout the rest of the nation and the Catholic world. The archdioceses named after these cities came to expect, almost naturally, and perhaps for some Catholics, a matter of divine right, to have a cardinal. They were, until recently, the centers of Catholic politics. They embodied the tensions, hopes, creative ideas, intellectual musings, ways of being church, models of parochial life, and even the sins of the Catholic world for a long while. At the center of thousands of Catholic faith communities, established in dioceses, in archdioceses in the Northeast and Midwest, were Euro-American Catholics. Since the early 19th century, and for a period of about a century and a half, millions of immigrants from Europe arrived in the United States to stay, to be church, and integrate themselves into the larger society. The children and grandchildren of these immigrants, inspired by the faith of their parents and grandparents, built and rebuilt a large number of structures that made Catholicism in these regions of the country highly visible. For instance, churches, schools, universities, hospitals, sanctuaries, etc. Catholics quickly became engaged in the construction of the United States as we know it today. Euro-American Catholics became highly involved in politics, the arts, the economy, intellectual life. Millions of Catholics joined the labor force that built roads, bridges, businesses, healthcare systems, and many other aspects of our daily life. Even though Catholics remain a minority vis-a-vis the total US population, about 24% of us in this country are Roman Catholic. And it is hard to ignore the visible and invisible Catholic footprint that exists in most large cities in the Northeast and in the Midwest. One of the most important questions that Euro-American Catholics engaged as they became part of the social fabric of this nation was whether they should be American or Catholic. The question in itself assumed that the two realities were dichotomous. As such, being fully Catholic would exclude being fully American, and vice versa. But the question as such is flawed, I think. How can anyone live in the United States and not be an American? Even those groups that were excluded and marginalized in our society developed a specific American identity and exhibited traits that would identify them as members of this society. Granted, perhaps not on equal terms and opportunities, yet still American. How can anyone baptized in the Roman Catholic tradition and intentionally understanding what that meant be something else than Catholic? Euro-American Catholics, then, needed a Chalcedon moment, quote unquote, and that came in the middle of the 20th century, particularly after World War II and at the time of the Second Vatican Council, where most of these Catholics came to terms that there was some compatibility between the American project and the Catholic project. Whether we agree or not with how such compatibility was articulated, and here we can highlight in particular the work of the Jesuit John Kearney Murray, the truth is that millions of Euro-American Catholics did not have much problem embracing the larger culture, somehow closing a cycle of Americanization that had begun about a century and a half earlier. As a Latino Catholic living in the United States, I have my own affirmations and critiques of that process. In terms of affirmations, there is no doubt that Euro-American Catholics largely made the so-called American dream come to life. Our society is clearly aware of the strength and insight of a clear and well-articulated Catholic voice. Many of the manifestations of the common good or instances in which we approximate to that sociopolitical goal have a clear imprint in our nation, as in the case of defense of life, the commitment to end poverty while taking care of the poor as our sisters and brothers, and the fight for just immigration reform, among others. In terms of critiques, it seems to me that in the process of reconciling being American and Catholic, many Euro-American Catholics compromised much of what was preserved in the national or ethnic churches and the popular Catholic enclaves in terms of religious identity. In becoming Americanized, many set their religious identity aside or became too comfortable, relegating it to the private realm to the detriment of their actions in public, thus becoming an illustration of what the Second Vatican Council warned in its pastoral constitution, Gaudium et Spes, the split between the faith which many profess and their daily lives deserves to be counted among the more serious errors of our age. Number 43. Finally, it seems to me that millions of your American Catholics continue to flirt too close with Protestant ways of being church and of practicing faith, predominant in the larger culture, both progressive and traditional edges of the ideological spectrum, historical Protestant churches, evangelicalism, for instance, with which we often define everyday life in this country. All in all, what is important in this reflection is that what for many in the United States and abroad, even to this day, the Euro-American Catholic experience is tantamount to simply the American Catholic experience. Of course, I disagree, as would anyone who has visited Catholic communities in Chicago, New York, or Washington, or Los Angeles, Houston, Atlanta, or Miami, or any other large city in the country. Of course, such perception provides a very limited picture of US Catholicism and ignores the main socio-demographic, cultural, and religious transformations that Catholicism in this country has endured, particularly during the last half a century. Of course, reducing the entire US Catholic experience to that of one specific group, particularly a group that shares a commonality in regards to the racial construct of whiteness, highlights the extent to which we as a Catholic community continue to ignore the voices of Black, Hispanic, Asian, and Native American Catholics, who together significantly outnumber the white Euro-American Catholic population in this country, and also brushes up too easily the particular histories of these communities that, by all historical standards, are not new. Let's not forget that Hispanics have been in this country for 5 centuries, or at least this territory. Mindful of the topic of this lecture and the time we have together, the rest of this reflection looks more closely at the Hispanic Catholic experience. 2. The new American Catholic experience in a 50% Hispanic Latino church. It is true that Hispanics are not new to the American experience. We have been in this land, we have been in this territory for the last 500 years. Even when Euro-American Catholics, European Catholics were establishing churches, schools, universities, hospitals, all throughout the country, Latinos were there. We became part of the United States of America through many ways: annexation, colonization, immigration. But particularly during the last 60, 70 years, the Hispanic population in the Catholic Church has increased dramatically. We speak of immigration waves of German Catholics, Irish Catholics, Italian Catholics, Polish Catholics, and others. When we speak about Latinos, we should speak about a tsunami. Right now, there are about 20 million immigrants of immigrant Hispanics or Latin Americans living in the United States of America. However, Hispanics are far from being a mainly immigrant community. 2/3 of Latinos, Latinas, about 64%, were born in the United States, been in the United States, and raised as citizens of this country. When we look at the Catholic population in particular, we know that about half of all Latinos who self-identify as Roman Catholic are Hispanic, and Latinos are immigrant, and about half of Latinos, Hispanics, who self-identify as Roman Catholic are US born. And the numbers continue to grow. We know that in the United States of America, about 4,500 parishes nationwide, that's about 25% of the entire Catholic number of Catholic parishes, serve the Hispanic community primarily in Spanish. We also know that 60% of all Catholics in the United States under the age of 18 self-identify as Roman Catholic. What we can say is that in this new American Catholic experience, the dice have been cast. We already know what Catholicism in the United States of America is going to look like in the rest of this century. 3. Contours in the new American Catholic experience. In light of this brief picture about what it means to be Hispanic and Catholic in the United States, and some of the major transformations that are defining American Catholicism, we need to ask ourselves whether this type of emerging Hispanic Catholic experience has enough room to grow, or whether the conditions exist for it to flourish. And the flower will blossom only if the soil in which it is planted is healthy and conducive to life. Allow me to highlight 3 contours. First contour, being Hispanic Catholic in structures that remain far too Euro-American, far too white. Hispanics are becoming a majority in the American Catholic population at a time when there is a large number of existing structures built mostly during the last 2 centuries. When I speak to different audiences, both ministerial and academic, I am often asked, why are not Hispanics building new churches and new schools and new institutions? I always respond, well, depends on where you ask the question. Remember, place and context matters. If you ask that question in the Northeast and in the Midwest, then the answer is simple. We already have plenty of churches and schools and other structures that actually we're struggling to maintain. The question in these regions is not primarily how and when we build more structures as Latinos, Latinas, Hispanics, but to make sure that they all serve Hispanic Catholics here and now without exception. It is very interesting when you visit different cities, different towns, to realize that one can perfectly ask in this country, where is the Hispanic church? And almost every Catholic can tell you the Hispanic church is right there. So the question is, why are not all Catholic churches in the United States open, ready, and willing to serve the Hispanic community? And not only the Hispanic community, but we also need to start asking about the new immigrant faces and their children and grandchildren. Catholics from Africa, Asians, and others that are arriving in this country. We still have too many parishes and schools and universities that do not welcome Hispanic Catholics, especially immigrants, and too many that do so using tokenistic approaches to ministry and education. My dear friends, we must change this. We must start treating Hispanics as the church, not as second-class citizens in our faith communities. When one takes a look at most Catholic structures and institutions in this country, the vast majority of leaders are Euro-American white. Despite the fact that Hispanics are nearly 50% of the entire US Catholic population, the percentage of Hispanics in positions of leadership is just a fraction. Bishops, barely 10% of all are Hispanic. Priests, about 10 to 12%. Vowed religious sisters, less than 5%. Catholic school principals, about 6%. Catholic college presidents, about 5%. Catholic theologians teaching in universities and seminaries, about 3 to 4%. Changes must happen at the leadership level for Hispanics not only to be represented in decision-making and decision instances, but also to share the wisdom that we bring from the different contexts from which we come and the communities that have nurtured us. Second contour, being American Catholic in a culturally diverse context, largely Hispanic. Change is happening at all levels in the church, but particularly at the grassroots level. Faith communities are being transformed by a fast-growing presence, mostly Hispanic. However, we should not ignore the fast growth of Catholics from Asia, who are the fastest growing group in the Catholic Church. Africa, the Middle East, the Caribbean, and other parts of the world. A new wave of Catholic immigrants and their children present us with a new opportunity to be church in a time of transformation, to test our current structures and commitments, and to renew what is not working anymore. This is exactly what Pope Francis calls us to do in terms of quote-unquote pastoral conversion. At the same time, we must be aware of the tensions that continue to permeate and affect relationships, the growth of our faith communities, and the definitions of pastoral and intellectual priorities in this emerging Catholic world. Racism and classism are two dynamics that we cannot ignore and must be named, actually denounced because of their destructive nature in the Catholic Church. The exclusion of Hispanic Catholics from certain communities that prefer to remain monoethnic and monolingual, the lack of promotion of Hispanic leaders in our ecclesial contexts and organizations. Just to give you a sense, most clergy, Hispanic clergy in this country are not pastors. And without being pastors, how is it possible that they are going to grow the skills and the experience to eventually work in offices at the chancery level and eventually become bishops? So we need to start looking at these dynamics. The lack of promotion of these Hispanic leaders in ecclesial contexts and organizations, and inability to treat Hispanics as the church are all expressions of bias. The recent pastoral letter of the Catholic bishops of the United States of America on racism open wide our hearts, the enduring call of love, reminded us that attitudes of cultural superiority, indifference, and racism need to be confronted. They are unworthy of any follower of Christ. American Catholicism is quickly transitioning from an experience shaped and dominated, even to this day, by Euro-American middle and upper class concerns, to an experience shaped by immigrant and working class concerns. Catholic schools and Catholic colleges often fail to welcome Hispanic families and children, either because they fail to reach out to them or simply because they cannot be afforded by a community in which more than half of its members live in poverty or close to the poverty level. Catholic parishes serving Hispanic Catholics struggle with poverty and lack of resources. In the Northeast and in the Midwest, these communities serving Hispanics are often among the first ones to be closed or consolidated, thus displacing Latino communities from parish to parish. If we are going to be authentically Catholic in the 21st century, we cannot ignore the needs and the cries of our own sisters and brothers who are Catholic here and now. Third contour: being American Catholic and Hispanic in an increasingly secular society. While the concerns of being together in culturally diverse parishes occupy much of our energy, we cannot ignore the fact that millions of Catholics have stopped self-identifying as such in recent decades, most of them young women and men. About 16 million Hispanics in the United States stopped self-identifying as Catholic in recent decades. Most of them did it before the age of 24. About 80% did not join any other religious group or church. They became de facto nones, non-religiously affiliated. These former Hispanic Catholics join about 20 to 25 million more, mostly white Euro-American Catholics who have followed similar course. How concerned should be a community that has lost about 40 million people in such a short period? If we asked the same questions of any business or a company losing 40 million customers, I bet the answers we would receive will be very interesting. And actually, I have asked that question to some economists. Hispanic Catholics, in general, struggle with high levels of religious illiteracy. This does not mean that Hispanics in general do not have faith. We do, and it is a strong faith. In fact, we have one of the highest levels of retention among Catholics in the United States. However, the problem is that Hispanics believe, but often cannot account for what we believe, particularly when the need emerges to give reason for what we believe or to engage in some of the most critical conversations in public life. This becomes a crucial issue at times of discussing the faith and the Catholic tradition in an increasingly secularized context. To this, we must add a generalized sense of anti-intellectualism, particularly among Hispanic immigrants, including many of their leaders in church and society, both lay and ordained, that echoes attitudes of distrust toward academic elites that are common in Latin America. Yet, in this, quote, knowledge society, close quote, like the United States of America, such anti-intellectualism is counterproductive. It prevents Hispanic Catholics from engaging the richness of the Catholic intellectual tradition in all its expressions, but more gravely, it exposes Hispanic Catholics to becoming discouraged about our faith tradition, especially at times when cultural Catholicism is not enough. Ironically, there exist a large numbers of Catholic centers, universities, and initiatives, mostly run by Euro-American Catholics and serving Euro-American Catholics, that could step up to the plate. We must ask ourselves, what is preventing these units from engaging Hispanic Catholics more directly? And what is preventing Hispanics from availing more intentionally from those resources? The question goes both ways. 4. Detours in the new American Catholic experience. Despite the fact that Hispanic Catholics did not define the contours within which our religious experience is to flourish in the United States, we trust in the Holy Spirit. We must do that. If Hispanics are in this country and in this territory, as we have been during the last 5 centuries, I am a firm believer that we are here for a reason. God wants us here to be church. Therefore, we must cast a hopeful view toward the realities and communities that are transforming American Catholicism and see the possibilities. There is no doubt that we are witnessing the birth of a fresher way of being Catholic in this country. Many are the characteristics that we can name regarding this fresher way of being church, and I'm going to highlight 3. First characteristic, or first detour, a fluid Catholic spirituality. Hispanic Catholics draw from various sources of spirituality, and the strongest one is the influence of centuries of Catholicism in Latin America, the Caribbean, and the Southwest, which until 1848 was part of Mexico. Keep in mind, as theologian Orlando Spin reminds us, that Latin American and Caribbean Catholicism, at its most basic roots, was shaped by a pre-Tridentine ecclesiology, which allowed it to embrace and even mix in a form of religious mestizaje with cultural and religious traditions that were part of the indigenous and Afro-Caribbean cultures in the continent at the time of the conquest and in subsequent centuries. Such Catholicism privileged popular religion and exhibited a profoundly communal nature grounded in the organic understanding of society and family life that characterizes Latin American and Caribbean societies. That same Catholicism made its way into what today is the United States of America through 3 processes: annexation, colonization, and immigration, as I mentioned before, during the last 2 centuries. During this process, it encountered a Catholicism that is more an expression of a post-Tridentine ecclesiology embodied primarily by Euro-American Catholics, focused largely on liturgical practice, canonical affairs, and an emphasis on the role of the clergy. Today, Hispanic Catholicism becomes the norm and the most widespread form of Catholic life in thousands of parishes as well as dioceses, particularly as Hispanic Catholics become the majority of the Catholic population. The main carriers of such pre-Tridentine Catholicism are immigrants. Yet, many of their children and grandchildren, although born and raised in the United States, are also highly influenced by it, or at least familiar with it, and often relate to such religious experience more than what they relate to the Euro-American Catholic experience. Such Hispanic Catholic spirituality, then, finds itself expressed in practices of popular Catholicism, prayer groups, confraternities, small ecclesial communities, apostolic movements, among others. We are witnessing a fresher and a very dynamic, fluid Catholic spirituality expressed through practices that often have more in common with the Catholic practices and commitments of other non-Euro-American white groups. Second detour, a new socio-demographic space. Euro-American Catholicism, as I mentioned earlier, remains highly defined by a middle upper class experience that is the result of major processes of social mobility and cultural accommodation that lasted about a century and a half. There is nothing wrong with this kind of Catholicism. As a matter of fact, we must celebrate the accomplishments of Euro-American Catholics, particularly during the last 2 centuries. We need to understand the fact that today we witness a Euro-American Catholic population that is highly educated. About 55% of Catholics who are adult Euro-American Catholics hold a college degree. That is compared to 16%, only 16% of Hispanic adults in this country holding a college degree. We cannot minimize the role that Catholic education has played in the life of the Euro-American population. By the 1940s and 50s, 55% of all white Euro-American Catholic children were enrolled in Catholic schools. We can pretty much see the correlation between these children enrolled in Catholic education and the large number of Euro-American Catholics with college degrees. Let's keep in mind also that, by and large, Black, Asian, and Latino communities were practically, intentionally, and de facto excluded from Catholic schools for a long while. Even today, barely 4% of Hispanic children, Catholic children who are school age, are enrolled in Catholic schools. Euro-American Catholics continue to perform a highly influential role in church and society, particularly through leadership. I mentioned earlier the role of bishops, clergy, sisters, deacons, lay leaders, women and men. Most of them exercising leadership in the Catholic Church are Euro-American white. But not only that, we also have lawyers, bankers, architects, doctors, academics, artists, all influenced by Catholic education, Catholic formation, most of them Euro-American white. Millions of Catholics who are non-Hispanic white wrestle with poverty and low levels of education. Allow me to repeat, about 2/3 of Hispanics in the United States of America live under the poverty level or close to the poverty level. Hispanic Catholics continue to wrestle with poverty. About 70% of Hispanic children in this country wrestle with poverty. We also see the effects of low levels of education. 71% of Hispanic children in the United States of America attend public underperforming schools. It is almost guaranteed that more than half of those children either will never attend college, and if they ever do, will not succeed in college. The impact of low poverty levels and low levels of education upon leadership in the Hispanic community, particularly in church and society, are very noticeable. For instance, we find a major gap between what the population is at large, the Hispanic population is at large, and also the Hispanic leadership when it comes to clergy or vowed religious or even lay leaders. We know that the majority of Catholics and of Hispanics in this country are US born, yet 85% of Hispanic priests in this country are foreign born. More than 95% of vowed religious women in the United States of America are foreign born. For some reason, we seem to be unable to foster vocations to the ordained priesthood, religious life, and even lay leadership in the Catholic Church in the Hispanic community. But I must say, where to begin the fostering of vocations to these callings within the church and beyond? We must start with education. We must begin with education. So we add to all of this the current financial, leadership, and institutional struggles of the predominant forms of Catholicism in the United States. Thus, this major detour points to the reality that Catholicism in the 21st century in the United States must learn how to be more in sync with the idea of, quote, a poor church for the poor, close quote, as Pope Francis suggests, thus entering a realm that has more in common with Catholicism in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, than with the idea of the triumphant church that came to be toward the middle of the 20th century. It is our choice. Where do we want to live? When do we want to do it? The third contour, a more synodal way of being church. There are elements in the Hispanic experience that somehow predispose Hispanic Catholics to embrace a more synodal way of being church. We speak of synodality primarily as a style of being church that expresses and brings life the calling to communion. Synodality is about communal discernment, consultation, and participation. Synodality comes to life in sociocultural contexts that privilege organic anthropologies primarily. The ethos of Hispanic and Latin American Catholics clearly exhibits such organic anthropology, and it should not surprise us that in the Euro-American world, where individualism and isolation of communities and individuals tend to prevail, the concept of synodality sounds foreign and even antagonistic to who we are and how we live our Catholicism. Hispanic Catholics are culturally predisposed to a synodal way of being church insofar as we still retain strong ties with Latin American Catholicism. Let's not forget, about half of all Catholics, Hispanic Catholics in the United States are foreign-born, coming from Latin America and the Caribbean. Hispanic cultures, families, and communities embrace and exhibit an organic anthropology that affirms the importance of communal dynamics and processes. Finally, Hispanics still embrace a sacramental view of reality that remains strong through popular religion and Catholic self-understanding. Historically, Hispanics continue to build on the wisdom of CELAM in its main meetings, particularly Medellin, Puebla, Santo Domingo, and more recently, Aparecida, all together becoming an authentic and grounded appropriation of the Second Vatican Council. Also, because of that, the historical dynamics that have shaped the lives of Latinos, Latinas, Hispanics in the United States, the idea of being a poor church for the poor comes natural to the experience of Latino Catholics who continue to be marginalized in many sectors of church and society. Ecclesially, Hispanics in the United States of America have a long history practicing pastoral de conjunto and teología de conjunto that exhibit the key characteristics of a synodal way of thinking and being together. Also, we have embraced and continue to use the pastoral and theological method that gives life to the traditional pastoral circle: see, judge, act. The encuentros, small ecclesial communities, base communities, apostolic movements, and other expressions of communal life may bring to life the idea of synodality and serve as models for the larger church in the United States of America. And my last point, a roadmap for American Catholicism in the 21st century. Attentive to these contours and detours, allow me to conclude these reflections by providing a roadmap. However, I am not here to tell Catholics how to live our faith or to prescribe magic formulas that will solve problems, because Hispanic Catholics are not a problem for the church, and neither is cultural diversity or the cultural diversity that identifies the contemporary Catholic experience. If anything, Hispanics are a blessing and an opportunity for American Catholicism, as the bishops of the United States remind us regularly, to renew itself in the 21st century. Therefore, looking at the richness and yes, complexity of the Hispanic Catholic experience, I want to draw a roadmap by pointing to 4 opportunities. Opportunity number 1, embrace the new spaces. There is no doubt that we are living in a new historical moment. This is a new birth, or rather, a rebirth for American Catholicism. We must come to terms that American Catholicism in the 21st century is not and will not return to the type of Catholicism that prevailed in the early part of the 20th century or during the 19th century. This is a new historical moment, and that becomes our space. We also need to come to terms with the fact that American Catholicism has been redrawn geographically. As of the year 2015, more than half of all Catholics in the United States of America now live in the South and the West, primarily thanks to the presence of Hispanic and Asian Catholics and other Catholics from Africa that are settling in these parts of the country. So now we don't look necessarily to Boston, Chicago, or New York, or Baltimore as to what is happening vis-a-vis Catholicism. We now need to start looking to Atlanta, Houston, Los Angeles, San Diego, and Miami, among many other places. We must embrace the socio-economic space in which now most Catholics in the United States of America live. We are transitioning, as was suggested earlier, from a community that is primarily middle upper class to a community that is immigrant working class. The questions change, the hermeneutics change, the epistemological assumptions change. And finally, we are inserted, we are thrown into a new ecclesial space, a new way of being church in the United States, where multiculturalism, where speaking Spanish, where popular devotion are at the forefront of who we are as Roman Catholics. Second, the second opportunity that I want to mention, new questions. As we look at the Hispanic Catholic experience transforming the church in the United States, we must begin to embrace the questions of a church that is poor. In other words, now we need to ask questions about how do we educate our children who are struggling with poverty? How do we preserve our young people from being lured into violence, gang activity? How do we, as a poor church, wrestle with the fact that about 9 million Hispanics, the vast majority of them Roman Catholic, are undocumented immigrants? How do we wrestle with the fact that the vast majority, more than 70% of farm workers in the United States of America are Hispanic, and most of them, the median income is $6 per hour? These are the questions of a poor church, a church that in the South and the West is growing in numbers, but does not have resources to build churches, schools, centers, universities. Many of those questions, then, are about survival, life and death, not questions of maintenance. 3, new voices. We must be aware and embrace the opportunity of the new voices. There are a plurality of voices from throughout the continent: Central, South, North America, the Caribbean, that coincide in the United States. These voices echo a multiplicity of experiences that were often dismissed or ignored, but now are at the forefront of who we are as Roman Catholics. There are fresher and more dynamic ways of advancing theological reflection using interdisciplinary methods, which actually is an invitation to look at the work of Latino, Latina, Hispanic theologians in this particular country. And the fourth opportunity, new ways of being American Catholic with a Hispanic flavor. Pay attention to young Hispanic Catholics. More than half of Hispanic Catholics in this country are younger than 29. These Latinos, Latinas, young Latinos, Latinas are living in between. They are neither immigrants, they are not American or Euro-American. They will not ever be immigrants again, and it is hardly that many of them will ever become fully Euro-American Catholics or embrace whiteness. So these are the people that are going to become bridge builders, gente puente. We must pay attention to the discourses emerging in Hispanic theological, philosophical, historical circles that are engaging in a process of retrieval of interesting sources, methods, and stories. We are at a point in which some of the best of the Latinx, Latino, Hispanic Catholic theology is doing it through using the method of narrative theology. Pay attention to a fascinating pluralism that highlights and affirms multiple religious experiences, grounded in a wide sacramental imagination that uses Catholicism as a canvas in order to allow works of art that perhaps have never been seen in this particular geography, yet are being born as U.S. Catholicism becomes increasingly Hispanic. Stay tuned. The Holy Spirit is in action. It is my sincerest hope that these reflections lead to enriching conversations and to an exercise of imagining, with Catholic imagination, what it means to be American and Catholic in an increasingly Hispanic church. This is a time of opportunity. It is God's time, a kairos. Hispanic Catholics are in this country for a reason. Let us discern together, walk together, pray together, and build communion together. Gracias. Indeed. Okay, so let me offer a couple of thoughts on the observation about flirting with Protestantism. In the process of becoming more Americanized, you're American Catholics particularly, and it's already happening also with Asian Catholics, with Latino Catholics who are third, fourth, fifth generation. We all do this. We must understand that the U.S. culture, cultura estadounidense, is highly defined by Protestant principles. We continue to that, and even Catholicism. I mean, as much as John Carney Murray saw some compatibility between Catholicism and the American project, as he called it, and his lens was primarily through natural law, but there are many other approaches that we could embrace. But what we need to understand also is that in the process of becoming more Americanized, Euro-American Catholics, or more assimilated, acculturated Catholics, also embraced different features of Protestantism. For instance, the idea of congregationalism is very strong in the United States of America and among Roman Catholics. The way we run our parishes, the way we understand our being community is highly influenced by congregational life. The way Roman Catholics in the United States of America understand how we have a voice, in the way we behave towards our leaders and how we receive and interpret doctrine, morals, is highly influenced by Protestantism. The way the way Roman Catholics, primarily Euro-American white Catholics, look at or at their faith, vis-a-vis the relationship private and public, once again, is very influenced by more of a Protestant ethic, and that applies across the ideological spectrum. Whether we look at more conservative Catholics or more traditional Catholics, there is a big affinity with evangelicalism. And for instance, we see a lot of alliances these days of Roman Catholics, mainly Euro-American Catholics, with evangelical Christians, for instance, on questions of pro-life, on questions of the death penalty, and so forth. But then we also see Euro-American Catholics who are more progressive, for instance, and making alliances and being pretty much of the same mind or a similar mind with historical Protestant Catholics on questions of social justice, on questions of women's rights, LGBTQ communities, and on and on. So that's what I'm referring, And having lived in a different part of the world, I was born in South America, and have traveled, have had the opportunity to travel to Africa and Europe. It is very clear that once you land in the United States of America, you are in a different Catholic world, and that world is highly influenced by Protestantism. So I do not see it as a flaw. I do not see it as something negative, but I see it as something that we all need to understand and embrace so we can appreciate what being American Catholic is about. And in terms of secularization, the non-religiously affiliated, we know that for every 10 Hispanic Catholics who leave Catholicism or stop self-identifying as Roman Catholic, 80% do not join anything. They do not join an evangelical group, they do not join a historical Protestant church, they do not become Mormons, they do not become Jehovah's Witnesses. Only 20% of his former Catholics, Hispanics who are former Catholics would do that. 80% become de facto non-religiously affiliated. Now, I'm not going to make the claim that anyone who is a non-religiously affiliated person is an atheist or an agnostic, but the fact is that over time, many do become like what Henri de Lubac used to call practical atheists, living as if God did not exist, living as if religion was not necessary. Whether they make a conscious decision of not having a spiritual or a particular religious grammar, is up to them. But many of them somehow drift into not embracing anything in particular. Absolutely. Thank you for asking that question. And we have a short memory. We don't have a historical memory as Roman Catholics. Our catechetical programs, adult faith formation, don't teach church history, our own history. We don't read about it. The Irish in the Northeast called the Italian immigrants the big Italian problem. That's what they call them. So and almost different groups of Catholics have treated each other with this negative language. My sense is we need better adult catechesis that retrieves history. We need to understand our history. That is the only way to create awareness, to grow in consciousness, and at the same time, to be honest with you, I think that we all have to grow more into. We have to read the gospel. We have to reread the Gospels. When we treat someone, when we use pejorative language to treat another human being, whether Catholic or non-Catholic, then there is something that is not clicking vis-a-vis the Gospel. But history, to me, is the key piece. Well, do you have another half an hour? No, it's just like those are big questions. On the question, are we selling our Latina, young, or Latino youth false dreams? You use the term pretentious. I think that on the one hand, I think that we should invite our young people to dream. I think that I tell my children, who wants to be president of the United States of America? And they both raise their hands. I asked my son one day, do you want to be a priest? And he said, no. And I was somewhat disappointed. And I said, why? And he said, because I want to be Pope. So I want them to. I think that we need to plant those seeds. We need, but the invitation to dream should be accompanied by the creation of the structures and the pathways that are going to allow these young women and men to dream, you know? So I think that we have done it in the past. We have done it in the past, but how do we change those systems? How do we change those systems? By being realistic. I'll give you an example. Catholic schools. In the United States of America, there are 8 million school-age Hispanic Catholic children. Only 320,000 are enrolled in Catholic schools. That's 4%. Even if we got every other child out of Catholic school and only enrolled Hispanic children, we would barely be tapping onto 20% of the Hispanic school-age population. So in order to have at least half of Hispanic children enrolled in Catholic schools, we would have to build 18,000 more Catholic schools. Show me who is building Catholic schools today. There are some dioceses. In the last year, in the previous year, 10 Catholic schools in this country were built. Only 10. But we closed 100. Okay? So the net is a net loss of 90 already. So how do we change systems? Let's change the battles. Why is it that Roman Catholics are not advocating? And here there's a group of community organizers. There's a group of political organizers. Why are we not changing the public school system so Hispanic and Black children can have a better opportunity? Because they are going to hyper-racialized, hyper-segregated schools. And as I said in the talk, 71% of Hispanic children are going to underperforming schools. So we are condemning these children not to succeed already by the fact that we're not providing good education. In Roman Catholics, what are we doing? We're not advocating, we're not trying to transform the public school system. We need to reform the prison system and the criminal justice system. Because what? Most of the people who are end up in the public and the criminal system, are Black and Hispanic, women and men. And Roman Catholics, what are we doing? We do prison ministry. We visit them, but very few are trying to change that system. So, what are the strategies? You're asking, how do we change systems? We got to change the strategies. We got to change the strategies. We got to change the way. We know that more Hispanics. We know that more than half of Hispanics who go to a university or a higher education go to community colleges, and we know that the vast majority of them never graduate from community colleges. Where is the Catholic Church working on that? I'm grateful for the Arrupe College that was established recently by the Jesuits at Loyola University, which is fascinating, But we need more of those. We need more of those energies. So we got to change those dynamics. We got to change the questions. We need to start. Pope Francis is big on this. We need to stop thinking just about intra-ecclesial matters and look at what is affecting the lives of our communities, of our people. And in the case of the Latino community, particularly our young Latinas and Latinos. Something that we need to, thank you first of all for sharing part of your story and for the question. We need to improve our adult education or outreach to adult Hispanics in terms of evangelization and leadership formation in the Catholic Church. And when I say leadership formation, both for the church and beyond. Our Catholic parishes should become centers of leadership formation for people to go to universities, for people to become involved in organizing, for people to become involved in political life, and all inspired by the faith. I had a chance to do a national study on Catholic parishes with Hispanic ministry, and something that surprised me was that of the 4,300 parishes back then with Hispanic ministry, about 40% had an adult faith formation program, give or take. And the average number of Latinos involved in that program was 20 per parish. Okay? So it's not even the tip of the iceberg, it's just drops, little drops that count, that are important. But I would love to see, I'm looking at this group of young women and men, and inspired by the faith and inspired by this idea of the Catholic identity and the Catholic tradition. We need pioneers. We need people doing something wild. We need people who spread the fire. We need people who, especially in coming from the Latino community. Gone are the days in which the Latino community had to wait for the Euro-American or the other or any other community to do something for us. We're about to be the majority of Catholics in this country. We got to do it ourselves, and we have to bring the best of what we do. But we have to educate ourselves. That's the key. Well, we need to start fostering vocations to priesthood, religious life, leadership within the U.S.-born population. Within the U.S.-born population. That's, many of us in this room came to the United States as adults, and it took us years, it took us 10, 15, 20 years to become comfortable with the culture, the language, and the understanding of what it means to be American and Catholic in order to be effective in our ministries. Young women and men in the United States of America don't have 20 years. They are living. Catholics in the United States of America young people are leaving the Catholic Church or the Catholic tradition at the age of 13, on average. At the age of 13. There is no time for us to wait until an immigrant becomes fully integrated, into the culture so we can serve well. 94% of Latinas under 18 are US born, mostly English speaking. About a quarter of Latinos in this country do not speak Spanish. So we got a workforce that mismatches the needs of the community severely, no? And I think that we need to find ways. And where are we going to find vocations to priesthood, religious life, leadership, lay leadership? Well, the holy grail for vocations in the history of Catholicism in this country was Catholic schools. And still to this day, the majority of priests, the majority of sisters have gone to Catholic schools. But Hispanics are absent in Catholic schools, from Catholic schools. So most likely my sense, and this is what I'm beginning to see in the study that I'm conducting right now, my sense is that it's going to be youth ministry, the source of vocations, and campus ministry. Youth ministry and campus ministry. That's how it's happening in Latin America. One of the challenges for campus ministry is that Latinos are also absent from universities, no? And particularly Catholic universities. How do we change that? In the entire country, barely 110,000 Hispanics are enrolled in Catholic colleges and universities. Barely. And if you take the 5 largest Catholic universities, they enroll almost half of all Hispanics already. So we need to change. That's kind of at the heart of my idea of contours and detours, We have been given a hand as Latinos, Latinas in the Catholic Church in this country. We are inheriting a church that has accomplished a lot, but also failed in many ways to bring us up. And not only Latinos, but also the Black Catholic community. We're losing Black Catholics in this country, little by little, particularly African Americans. And not many people are doing much about it. But those are the contours that we are given. I'm not saying that they are fixed, but we have to work within those systems until we are able to expand them, to break them as necessary. But it is through the detours, it is through what we bring, that energy that we bring, idea of synodality, pastoral de conjunto, that idea of a fluidity of spiritualities, those new ways of being Catholic at the communal level in parishes, apostolic movements, ecclesial movements. That's how we begin to make some inroads. Thank you. Without a doubt, I mean, just in terms of intellectual honesty, I pick my battles as a researcher and as a theologian, and most of my work looks closely at the existing structures and traditional structures. I look closely at parishes and schools, universities, and so forth, And because it is in many ways a more tangible way to measure that involvement of the Latino community, and also to move, when we have the structures, you can move the mechanisms within those structures or change them as necessary. But yes, I agree 100% with you. There are many ways in which many other spaces, and not only community organizing, political activism, but for instance, artistic life. Where are the efforts in the Latino community or in ministry in the Catholic Church to support Latino Catholics who are doing artistic work through literature, painting, theater, or another space is social media, And we know that many Latinos spend countless hours in social media, but do we have something specific, strategic, to reach out to them? So yes, there are new spaces. They are more difficult to track. Those spaces are much more difficult to track, but I think that as long as we have the energy, we're going to need more researchers. I hope that out of this talk, at least half of you want to be Catholic theologians, and teach in universities. And engage in this in this type of research, because that's what we need. We need to see what those new spaces are and what wisdom and what energy are bringing into Catholicism. Thank you. That's a good point.